Greetings and welcome to our discussion of the 33rd Sunday of this year, the C cycle. And our readings this time, first reading comes from the prophet Malachi, chapter 3, verses 19 through 20a, just a couple of quick verses there. The second letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. And the gospel tradition according to Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 19. Now, you will remember, as we are coming now to the conclusion, really this time of a week-by-week following of Luke's story of Jesus, that he had been in the temple area teaching, and as we saw last time, he had been was being tested by different groups who were in the temple area. First had to do with a coin image, which we did not talk about. Namely, they challenged Jesus to who did they owe tribute. Did they owe tribute to the temple or tribute to the government? And they had brought the coin. And then last time we saw the issue that the Sadducees had brought about the so-called Levirate rule or law, and to whom did the widow who had been married 7 times belong. Now, the story continues, and we're not going to hear all of that Jesus is still in the temple area. And in verse 29, we ended last time with verse 20, I believe, in chapter 20, verses 27 through 38 are missing. Well, in 39, Jesus is praised by some of the scribes. Remember that they are the folks who are in the temple area here, Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees. But verse 40 says that no one dared to question Jesus anymore because, in a certain way, they did not want to be thwarted again by some response that Jesus would give. In verse 41, Jesus poses a challenge now to his listeners or to those around him, because if Jesus is the Messiah, then how does David fit into this picture? Interestingly, verses 42 through 44, again, we're not going to hear those, but those are the ones that continue, where David calls Jesus Lord, then how can he be his son? And this kind of cleverness with regard to the title of and the meaning of the term Messiah is played around with. There is no real answer here, but Jesus challenges his hearers to answer that question because they know that it is very difficult, and if they do, they might have to agree that Jesus could and should bear the title Messiah. Now, at this point, for whatever reasons we're not quite sure, verses 45 through 47, Jesus says to the group, stay away from the scribes. Why now? Now, it's not all of the scribes, but apparently it's some of the scribes, who, he says, look for front seats in the synagogue so they can be seen right up in front. Maybe that's why Catholics don't sit up in front, because they don't want to be accused of being guilty of this act, just passing thought. That they are first, that is, the scribes look for the first seats at banquets, that they seek public acclaim, and that these particular scribes, now we're really not sure who they are, only that they're there, seek honor. And therefore, Jesus says they are to be avoided. Now, this is interesting action that Jesus takes. Chapter 21 begins with verse 1, in which it is pictured that there are some rich people who are throwing gifts into the treasury box. Now again, As always, Luke is very concerned about things that have to do with financial affairs, gifts. And then in verses 2 and 3, he points out that there's a certain widow who contributes 2 copper coins. And Jesus responds in verse 4 that this widow, he says, has given out of her abundance, which is, Jesus concludes, everything she has to live on, where the others give out of their abundance. They have, it doesn't hurt them too much to be contributing to the temple treasury. Now, generally, this is considered to be, by most interpreters of that particular action of the woman, one of praise. Certainly, she has done exactly what Jesus has often been teaching, namely, one should give. We had the example of Zacchaeus a couple of weeks ago, where he had given half of all that he earned and offered to pay 40% or 4 times whatever if he had defrauded everyone. And so generally, this little action on the part of the widow is considered to be one of praise given by Jesus. Although we may have mentioned earlier on in other discussions that there are some interpreters of the action of the woman here of giving the 2 copper coins, which are all she has to live on, in a more critical way, saying that this woman, unfortunately, by her action, is really buying into the corruption of those who run the temple area and are using the money of the poor as well as the rich to enable them their own pockets to be increased, and are not taking care of those who really need the money. Now, whether that interpretation, which is a bit more critical, where Jesus says this woman is really being taken advantage of and is playing into the system, is the correct interpretation, is discussed by scholars. But it's interesting how a single action can receive a variety of interpretations, none of which we're at times absolutely sure what the gospel writer had in mind. That brings us now to this week's episode, where it begins by some praising the beautifulness of the temple area. Now, one remembers that in Jesus' time the temple stood. The temple, we have noted a number of times, in some ways, now here's the interesting part of it, that the temple in Jesus' time was in fact under construction, that under the beginning, under the aegis of Herod the Great, and continuing through his successors, the temple area was in fact expanded. The whole dynamic of the temple was perhaps given, almost a half of what it had been prior to the efforts of Herod. Now, the temple building itself stood in the center, not in the center, but in the midst, and that may not be might not much have been interpreted or being redone in the time of Jesus. It was a beautiful building in many ways. It was built of stone that were white and strong, and I think the size of the blocks that made the temple here were interesting. They were 25 cubits long, 8 cubits high, and 12 cubits depth. Now, some of these stones, because keep in mind that the temple that Jesus is pictured as being part of and describing here and listening to others when Jesus says that this temple will come to a tragic end, are sometimes pictured as Jesus predicting an event which did take place, you remember, in the year 70 of the Common Time, when the Roman army after several years of attempting to take the city of Jerusalem, had conquered it by raising ramparts against the walls of the city and had overtaken it. And we are indebted much to the writing of the Jewish historian Josephus, who describes much of what happened when the forces of Rome finally breached the gates of the city and took the city. And he describes it as quite brutal, that what happened here is that the armies of Rome went through the various streets of the city. Now, you may have seen a picture of the city of Jerusalem, which was quite extensive. The temple area took up about a third of the city, but many other houses and homes were to be found in the city of Jerusalem. And as the soldiers, so according to Josephus, were marching through, they were brutalizing, killing many who were in the way as they moved forward. A number of citizens of the city tried to escape, but they were taken prisoners, and later, according to Josephus, were taken to Rome in a great triumph. This whole action was engineered by the General Titus, who later became the emperor of Rome, but at this point he was the son of the current emperor and was credited with destroying the city of Jerusalem. Now, I mention all of this because the temple itself was destroyed. The innerness, particularly the famous lampstand that was the symbol of Judaism, was taken and again brought to Rome. In fact, in the city of Rome is an arch called the Arch of Titus, in which in top, you can notice this, inscribed some of the victories of Titus in the city of Jerusalem, and there, of course, is the candelabra that was taken by the conquering army. Now, all of this is important, perhaps, to notice, because when Jesus is pictured as praising the beauty of the temple, and it was particularly the entrance, which was as tall as the building itself, was laced with much design that was made in gold and silver, and therefore, even from a distance, one could notice the temple as one was coming up to the city of Jerusalem. The temple, so the stories are told, that was dissembled, not only the temple but the area, block by block. Now, I mention all of this because some of those blocks were tossed over the city walls of the city and left in a huge dump at the foot of the entrance, one of the sides of the temple. Archaeologists have uncovered those, and if you see pictures of them, they truly were huge stones, and one wonders exactly how they got them up and put them in place to build such a place. So all of this is that Jesus is saying that the time for the temple and its presence among the people is indeed limited. Now, at this point, in verse 7 of chapter 21, which we're looking at this time, someone asks for a timetable. When is this going to happen? Well, when is what going to happen? The destruction of Jerusalem? No. When is the coming of the kingdom? And this brings us into a pattern of thinking which is called eschatology, namely, or apocalypticism, namely looking for a future time, for a new experience that is going to happen. And there are those who are who are asking now, who are these unnamed? We're not sure. We think they probably were the disciples raising this question. Pictures Jesus as saying that he should not be concerned, they should not be so concerned about this, but rather Luke pictures Jesus as saying that what should be the concern of people, who they should be concerned about, were followers who listened to false teachers, or who perhaps were seeking to change the message of the kingdom that Jesus was proclaiming. Now, this whole episode, the section that is episode in the gospel, is interesting and is traditional, I wanted to say. That predictions were known to be made, and here we hear some of them now. Predictions as a nation rising against nation, that there will be earthquakes, famines, plagues, heavenly portents. All will be signs of the coming of a new age and of the end of this one. Now, keep in mind that by the time that this episode has been written, the temple has been destroyed. And some of the things that are mentioned as possibilities may be background on the part of Luke for including them. For example, there was a severe famine which struck Judea between the years 41 and 54. That would have been during the reign of the Emperor Claudius. And that a terrible earthquake, we hear this, evidence of this had taken place in Philippi, and this is mentioned in the Acts. So some of these tragedies did occur. Now, we're not sure whether or not is the basis for Luke's picturing Jesus including this at this point. We're not sure. Verse 12 attends to what will happen to his disciples in the near future. Now, I take this opportunity as we come to the end of listening to the Lucan Gospel to remind ourselves that there is a companion piece to Luke's Gospel, namely the Acts of the Apostles. We have looked at sections of the Acts earlier this year during the Easter time. But keep in mind that as Luke is writing this story, he knows what has happened after the ascension of Jesus and even after the death of Peter and Paul. And as we mentioned, in looking at the total framework of these two works, Luke presents for the consideration of those who hear his word three great heroes, namely Jesus, Peter, and Paul. Now, certainly in the gospel, it is Jesus who is the hero, but from time to time, in the event stories that are related about Jesus, we are introduced to Peter. One remembers that Peter gets a rather sympathetic but important position attributed to him or given to him by Jesus. So Peter will, after the ascension of Jesus and the coming of the Spirit in the early part of the Acts, emerge as the central figure. We noticed a lot of this, but just kind of to put this into complete perspective. And midway through the book of Acts, then the new hero until the end of the work turns out to be Paul. Now, why do we mention all of this? Because in this little section, Jesus predicts what will happen to his disciples in the near future, that there will be arrests, persecutions, imprisonments, and trials before the rulers. And these really, when we look at it, depict what will happen and did happen as recorded in the Acts to Peter and Paul. See, so that one can notice the rationale for these words and this kind of prediction being placed in this particular section, and these words given by Jesus to the audience. So there's a fulfillment, if one wants, of these words of Jesus in the Acts with regard, and we've seen some of this, and you can see this, that all of these things mentioned happen to Peter and to Paul. However, in verse 14, Jesus encourages his audience not to dwell on these things because, again, as we have noticed, for Luke's perspective, Jesus is teaching about the kingdom, not simply as something which will happen in the future, but argues and teaches that the kingdom of God is among us, is present. And this is important for all who accept the teaching of Jesus to be aware of. So, those who reject the teaching of Jesus, now this is verse 16, reject his followers, will find, and notice the carefully, he will be rejected, they will be rejected, not only in the synagogue, not only among the Roman officials, but also within their families. And of course, this can be very painful, but those who accept Jesus' way should expect that there will be tension and sometimes rejection by parents, by siblings, and by friends. So although one might expect persecution to come from outside, one will probably find it much more painful to find rejection, what we might call inside, within the family itself. And again, Jesus encourages his hearers, encourages us to stay firm in our beliefs and in our ways of acting. So as we move now, this time, to the conclusion, really, of listening to words of Luke with regard to his story of Jesus. We will hear one more when we come next time, but it will be a kind of replay of one incident in the Lucan story. Notice that the whole of Lucan's story has been very much built on key principles, key beliefs. The most important has been compassion and hospitality. Jesus is often pictured, as we have seen in Luke's story, as eating with others, often eating not simply with those whom you would expect, that is, he did eat with those in positions of wellness, and wellness here not so much by health, but as by position, by possession, but also that Jesus had dined with, as we've seen a number of times, unlikelies from the viewpoint of the tradition, sinners, and so therefore the meal had become very much a symbol of how Jesus hoped to help others appreciate the coming of the kingdom. So those have been certain characteristics that we have noticed in the Gospel of Luke. We pointed out on a few times the importance of the temple as both the beginning of the story of Jesus. After all, in the infancy stories, which we will be hearing more about again in a few weeks, but in the infancy accounts, Jesus' parents bring him to the temple shortly after his birth. He is found in the temple, and now he has come to the temple, is teaching in the temple, and speaks in the words that we hear this time of the demise of the temple. The temple will be destroyed, and in fact, that temple in Jerusalem has never been rebuilt. There is some concern or interest in quarters, particularly in Judaism, of rebuilding the temple there, but the chances of that occurring are probably minimal because on the traditional temple site today stands the mosque of the Islamic community, and that is the cause of some concern, certainly in Israel today. But Luke's story beautifully, the hospitality that is extended by Jesus, not just to the Hebrew community, not just to Christians, but to everyone. And keep in mind that some of the message of Luke's gospel, as we again on a number of occasions pointed out, is addressed to what we believe may well be listeners who were pretty much well off. And thus, why the emphasis is that those whom God has blessed with the material goods of this world need to find ways and continue to find ways to share it with those who are not so fortunate. And so the idea of the poor, of the outcast, are also characteristics we have noticed of Luke's story. A very powerful remembrance of Jesus that the third gospel writer has presented and that we have been looking at this year. Just in conclusion, the first reading comes from the prophet Malachi, who was a 6th century before the common time author. We don't hear too much of him. The two key words in the short little reading we hear: the day is coming and the days will be coming. For Malachi, who was typical of the prophets, it will be a day of reckoning for the wicked. And he pictures it in terms of a furnace, a blazing fire, which will reduce everyone who is bad. Now, this is typical of some of the prophet like Malachi, reduce all the bad to ashes. But the just will shine like the sun, S-U-N, of justice. Now, this is an interesting phrase because many of the ancients of the world, and right even at Jesus' time, saw the sun as one of the ways of illustrating their gods. That's why in the Hebrew Bible, the term sun, S-U-N, is not used too often because they tried to avoid that connection. So those peoples who worship the sun, was not part, certainly, of Jewish tradition, and is not going to be part of the believers in Jesus. But all of that is that there will come a day. The days are coming. And I think that's one of the balances that we hope this little section from Malachi will encourage us to always be prepared. Yes, we look forward to the coming of Jesus in glory. We look forward to a new time, to a new heaven and a new earth. Again, a language that is frequently used in our liturgy, but also reminded often by Jesus, important as he was looking to a future, seeing that the future was built by the present. The kingdom of God is among us. The presence of Jesus is with us. And so, once again, the temple may be gone, but as the writer Paul would point out in one of his letters, the real temple of the Lord is none other than the believers. We are, says the writer Paul in his reflections, the temple of God. The presence, therefore, in which the risen Jesus is experienced, and our lives are transformed, says Paul, by that. So although all of the thinking this time around does in some way revolve around the temple, perhaps we conclude by remembering that the temple in Christian thinking is more than simply a building or a place, but is the way in which the presence of the risen Lord does reside. Thank you for being with us, and we hope to see you again.